Pleasure to be with you again tonight. And it's a little different from what it has been at other occasions, as I'm going to do a little bit promotion for myself and for my latest book. Well, I hope it's not just translation, but I want to tell you something about this book, the background and the content, and place it in a somewhat larger content. I wrote a book, as some of you know, recently, and that is, let me see, this book, Adventists and Catholics, The History of a Turbulent Relationship. It's published by Peter Lang Publishers, and it's just new, August of this year. And I personally think it looks pretty good, and I am very pleased with the result. Now, the turbulent relationship between Protestants and Adventists is not something recent. There have been centuries of conflict. In Reformation time, Europe was split in Protestants and Catholics, resulting in a lot of persecution and violence. And for all of us who know something about history, we know about the problems of post-Reformation times, the wars of religion, and how also the divide between Protestants and Catholics had an influence on colonization and the way these various religions were spread over the world. And now, in more recent history, of course, we know that Protestant and Catholics remain separate and often, though less so, hostile towards each other. In my book, I focus in particular on 19th century America. 19th century was an interesting period, shaping of a new world, and the world was entering in a new era, industry, steam machines, railroads, and other infrastructure. It was in the US the time of the Civil War, the slavery issue, the problems between North and South. It was a time of a different kind of morality, which we now often refer to as Victorian. It was at the same time also the time of religious revivals, the Great Awakening in the 30s and 40s of the 18th century, the Second Great Awakening a bit later, going until the 1840s. And then in particular, I'm zooming in on the Miller movement, which was on the tail of this Second Great Awakening in the 1830s, going on to 1844. It was also a time of a number of religious upstarts, in particular in one area, Upper New York State, the burnt-over district, where a number of new religions found their origin. A time also of various reform movements, health, temperance, dress. Well, a lot can be said about the 19th century, but that is the background of also the genesis of Seventh-day Adventism. In my book, I'm zooming in on Roman Catholicism, and it is important to note that after Protestants were coming to the United States, they were followed by a huge number of Roman Catholics. In the year 1800, a population of about 5.3 million, there were just very few Roman Catholics, about 50,000 altogether. 50 years later, 23 million Americans, but just 1.6 million Catholics. But then we see a big jump in the second part of the 19th century when, yes, the population rose, but the amount of Catholics rose to 10 million. And we see that since then, the rise of Roman Catholics, of the numbers, have gone on. But it's important to note that in the 19th century in the United States, the arrival of Roman Catholics was something that worried Protestants to a very large degree. American Catholicism, there was some of it when Catholic missionaries came to Florida, to the West Coast, and to the French-speaking areas. In colonial times, when the Catholics came, they came mostly from Germany, France, some from England, but really the first significant group of Catholics came to Maryland after King Charles gave a charter to George Calvert and gave him the possibility of bringing Catholics to this area, Maryland. Huge numbers of Catholics came from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Eastern Europe, and they formed an enormous crowd of Roman Catholics who came to the United States. They grew from 0.5% in the 19th century to 23% of the population. And they not only grew in numbers, but they were very successful in their institutional growth, a school system, a health system, the establishment of parishes all over the country, the building of a hierarchy, bishops, and they became an official church province in 1908, no longer a mission status, but full status within the Roman Catholic Church. Since then, in the 19th century, there has been a sustained anti-Catholicism in the United States. This anti-Catholicism was imported from Britain, where there had been, in the 19th century and even earlier, also a significant, strong anti-Catholicism among major parts of the population. But in the United States, Protestantism was really worried about this large influx of Roman Catholics, people who might be loyal to the Pope in Rome rather than to the American authorities. Protestant churches in general were very anti-Catholic in word and sometimes also in deed. There were some dedicated journals only talking about the danger of the Roman Catholic Church. There were organizations that wanted to make or keep America as a Protestant nation, one of them being the American Protective Organization, organized in 1887. There were even some political parties like the ultra-nationalistic party of the Know Nothings in the 1850s that they were quite anti-Catholic. Hate literature, we find one of the books, The Awful Disclosures, about Maria Monk, a nun, about all the terrible things that were supposed to happen in the convents. And some extremism, 1844, Philadelphia riots, violence against some Catholic institutions, and the Ku Klux Klan was to a large extent also anti-Catholic. So this is just a few things illustrating the sustained anti-Catholicism of the 19th century. In Protestantism, this anti-Catholicism was a political thing, jobs were taken away. That was the fear. The loyalty of people was at stake, but it was also, in particular, a religious thing, a theological thing. It had to do with prophetic interpretation. And a lot of these things came from the European continent and were imported into the United States. The general Protestant heritage with its anti-Catholicism did its work. Important were the consensus, almost total consensus about the principle of historicism. You could explain the prophecies and find various powers at work, and Roman Catholicism was one of them. Quite commonly accepted was also the year-day principle. You find some of these time prophecies in the Bible, and you just take the number of days and make that in the number of years, and then you try to find dates in history, beginning and end for these periods. In America, in particular, all kinds of ideas about the millennium were very important. In fact, one American scholar said that America was drunk on the millennium. Now, many were pre-millennialists, but even more were post-millennialists. But millennium was a very important aspect of the prophetic interpretations in Protestantism. And then there was the almost common, almost consensus that Roman Catholicism played a role in the prophecies of Daniel and the Revelation, the papacy in particular, the Antichrist, the little horn, Babylon. They were identified as Roman Catholicism and its allies. This was the kind of thing that played a major role also in the Millerite movement. And there are many different books about Miller, and maybe some of you have read them. Very interesting how this movement grew, the role of Miller and his associates, the lectures of Miller that became the backbone of much of the thinking of the Millerites in their journals, in their books, meetings and camp meetings. The Millerite movement grew from a very small beginning to a movement that may have counted maybe 500,000 people who were, at least to some extent, associated with the Millerites. When Sabbatarian Adventism began on the ruins of Millerism, then this prophetic interpretation that was common in the Miller movement was further developed by such people as James White in many different articles and some books also, but in particular Uriah Smith in his books, Thoughts Critical and Practical on Daniel and the Revelation. Actually, I think Revelation came before Daniel. Then the book by G.N. Andrews, a self-made scholar, but really a scholar who wrote his book on the history on the Sabbath and connected the prophecies with the change of Sabbath into Sunday. And of course, the development of the book by Ellen White, The Great Controversy, which went through various phases and got its final version in 1911. So the prophetic interpretation was a very major factor in keeping the anti-Adventism alive, anti-Catholicism alive, and further nurturing it. Important was both the link with the Sabbath and the link with eschatology. The change from Sabbath to Sunday was emphasized by Andrews, but became a common feature of the prophetic interpretation. Louis Conradi was the one in Europe who, to a large extent, accepted the findings of Andrews, but had some nuances. But basically, he also was defending the role of this controversy, and this became part of anti-Catholicism. This is what the Catholic Church has done. They changed the commandments of God, and thus we lost the Sabbath, and the world was keeping the Sunday. And this anti-Catholicism that the Americans experienced in the 19th century, this was further developed in the eschatological views of Seventh-day Adventism. There was going to be a coalition of apostate powers. We might not see it yet, but it's coming, orchestrated by Rome. Then the theory of the mark and of the beast and the seal of God, focusing on Sabbath and Sunday, the apostate church and the Church of God. And of course, there was the idea that Sunday laws would come and would eventually be worldwide and would eventually bring end-time persecution of all the Sabbath keepers. Well, as Seventh-day Adventism developed further, there were some key elements of prophetic interpretation that helped fuel further the anti-Catholic sentiments. The little horn, the man of sin in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, that is Roman Catholicism. The first beast in Revelation, that is also identified as Roman Catholicism. The second beast, the beast that comes from the earth, was gradually accepted as being the United States of America. A lot of focus in the 19th century and early 20th century was on the deadly wound that is mentioned in the book of Revelation, and on the question when it was healed. And the Adventists made a big thing of all the signs that told them that there was a wound, that the Pope was not as mighty, not as powerful as he had been before. He lost his earthly possessions, but then there were all kinds of signs that the wound was gradually being healed. And there was no unanimity about the fact when it was exactly healed, but there was such a process, and the Pope was really becoming more and more powerful. There was the mark of the beast, the seal of God, Sunday, Sabbath. There was the idea introduced gradually of the title of the Pope, 666, the number of the beast. How do we explain that? Well, there was the suggestion that this might be Vicarius Filii Dei, and I think that more and more people now in the Seventh-day Adventist Church accept that this is really not a very strong, there's really not a very strong argument to see 666 as the Vicarius Filii Dei application. All these things were combined with the three angels' messages, Revelation 14, Babylon. Some felt it was just Roman Catholicism. Others felt it was not only Roman Catholicism, but it was a combination of Roman Catholicism and apostate, what they call apostate Protestantism. Everything that was not Seventh-day Adventist was called apostate Protestantism, together with Roman Catholicism. That was Babylon. And a complete end-time scenario gradually developed, and with all kinds of schemes, these drawings with everything happening according to a particular time scale. And we find quite a few of these things still, in particular, at the fringes of the church. And there remained a continued interest also in the millennium. These were some of the key elements of prophetic interpretation that developed and stayed with us and strengthened the anti-Catholic feelings. In the magazines, in the journals of the church, you find that there is a constant referral to the popish errors. The Catholic doctrines that were a fountain of deadly errors. And there was an endless referral to the endless horde of false theories of the Roman Catholic Church. Emphasis on how the Mass was a horrible, heretical replacement of the sacrifice of Christ, and of course, Sunday worship. Increasingly also a reference to the immortality of the soul, which gave rise to the theory of the saint adoration and the role of Mary, and then referral to idols and relics, the status of the Pope, and of course the Catholic view of salvation with the emphasis on good works, on penitence, etc., etc. So all of this is part of the anti-Catholic sentiment that was very strong and became stronger as the 19th century progressed. There was, and still is, an interesting use of a number of catecheses that were developed within Roman Catholicism. And you find a number of these catechisms that are mentioned all the time in all the Adventist publications that deal about Sabbath Sunday and deal about the role of the papacy. One of these catecheses is the one by Tuberville. And this is a quote that you find time and again, and you still find that occasionally in books by Seventh-day Adventists that are published even today. So this is this quote that is more than a century old. Why was the Jewish Sabbath changed into Sunday? Because Christ was born on a Sunday, rose from the dead on a Sunday, and sent down the Holy Ghost on a Sunday. Works not inferior to the creation of the world. By whom was it changed? Well, the answer is by the governors of the church. This is what several of these catecheses refer to. The Sabbath was no longer valid because it was changed by the church. And these catecheses, they were quoted all the time and are even quoted today in many Adventist publications. The most anti-Catholic publication that the church has published was the book, The Great Controversy by Ellen G. White. And you know that I wrote a bit about this topic, and there was an essay that recently was published by Adventist Today on its website, where I tried to say that it's an important book, but it is a 19th century book. It developed over time. The first edition, roughly, of what the book is now, is from 1884. Then the more definite edition, 1888, with some revisions in 1911. But it was a book that basically originated in the 19th century against the background of current anti-Catholicism that you could see in all or practically all the Protestant churches in the United States. It was dependent, we are told, on visions. Ellen White had a major vision in which she saw the events that play out and that she wrote about in the book The Great Controversy. But we now know that she was highly dependent on a number of authors and also copying some of their errors, Daubigny, Willie, and others. What worries more and more people is that the book is Eurocentric, and it has no reference to the wider world of Christianity, such as Eastern Christianity. And there is not one mention in the book about Islam or other world religions. One of the main points in the Great Controversy that I want to challenge is that the focus is on the unchanging nature of Roman Catholicism. And that tells people today, look, whatever Roman Catholicism looks like, it is still the same anti-Christian power that it was in the Middle Ages. Just an important quote from the Great Controversy. The papacy is just what prophecy declared she would be, the apostasy of the latter times. It is part of her, that is Roman Catholic policy, to assume the character which will best accomplish her purpose. But beneath the variable appearance of the chameleon, she conceals the invariable venom of the serpent. And then, a few pages later, the Protestants of the United States will be foremost in stretching their hands across the gulf to grasp the hand of spiritualism. They will reach over the abyss to clasp hands with the Roman power. And under the influence of this threefold union, this country will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling on the rights of conscience. Now, these words are repeated over and over again, and they are supposed to indicate that whatever Rome does, it cannot get credit for any positive thing because they are just a chameleon, but they conceal the invariable venom of the serpent. Well, I object to the fact that this still is the basis for our attitude towards Roman Catholicism. These words could have been spoken by many Protestant leaders in the 19th century, but in most churches there is the awareness that we need to speak in a different kind of language about fellow Christians. And in fact, Ellen White also certainly in the latter part of her ministry had some other things to say about Roman Catholicism. And that makes me think that had she lived, she might have been a little bit different in what she would say about Roman Catholicism. Here is a letter from 1887. There is danger that our ministers will say too much against the Catholics and provoke against themselves the strongest prejudices of that church. There are many souls in the Roman Catholic faith who are looking with interest to this people. But the power of the priest over his charges is great. And if he can prejudice the people by his stay-away arguments, so that when the truth is uttered against the fallen churches, they may not hear it, he will surely do it. But as laborers together with God, we are provided with spiritual weapons, mighty to the pulling down of the strongholds of the enemy. But interesting, she says, we may be actually saying too much, and we must be careful not to provoke their prejudices. Now, that may not be the most noble motive, but still, it's significant that she would say that. There is need, she says, and this is also put in the compilation Counsels to Editors, there is need of a much closer study of the Word of God, especially should Daniel and the Revelation have attention as never before in the history of our work. We may have less to say in some lines in regard to the Roman power and the papacy, but we should call attention to what the prophets and the apostles have written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But still, we may have to say less in some lines regarding to the Roman power and the papacy. Behind the writing of the Great Controversy and the publication of many other journals and books in Seventh-day Adventism in the 19th century, early 20th century, behind that we must remember that there were indeed political and church attempts to promote Sunday in a way that was worrying to Seventh-day Adventists. There was a national reform movement, making America great again. Well, making America a Christian nation. And part of that making America a Christian nation was having a sacred day of rest. And there were quite a few law proposals, so-called blue laws, and there are different explanations as to what that word blue refers to. But there were Sunday laws in many states in the US in the 1880s and 1890s, and 17 of the states used these laws to prosecute Sabbath keepers. That meant that, in particular, in Arkansas and Tennessee, Adventists were persecuted, and some ended up in jail and had some extended prison sentences. There were attempts to pass laws, the Blair Amendment in 1888 and the Breckinridge law proposal in DC that aimed at establishing a kind of national Sunday law. There was a lot of commotion around the Chicago World Fair, and people said, well, we should not finance part of the World Fair as long as it would be open on Sundays. There was a large struggle about that. And there was, and we have no time to go into that, a campaign for calendar reform. And so this idea of Sunday being important, Sunday as something that should be prescribed by law, was quite prominent in parts of the United States in the late 19th century. And this is a background for this Adventist fear of Sunday laws becoming global, becoming worldwide. And so we can understand that there was that fear. We can understand that Ellen White wrote about that fear. And we can understand that there was this idea that this might not be national only, but become global. But there is ample reason, I think, in our day and age to rethink that. And that background is no longer there. As time moved on, Seventh-day Adventists, in their anti-Catholic attitude, they tended in the church publications and in sermons and in books to comment on lots of Catholic-related events, about the deadly wound, which meant restriction in the power of the papacy, but then also the healing of the deadly wound, the resurgence of Roman Catholic influence. The Adventists writers would react to various encyclicals, for instance, the Rerum Novarum and the Syllabus Errorum, with all kinds of statements that Adventists found fault with. And one of the major points of criticism within Adventism in the late 19th century was what happened at the Vatican I, when the doctrine of papal infallibility was accepted. For a while, between 1909 and 1915, the Adventists published a magazine that was totally devoted to fighting the Roman Catholic influence, and that was the Protestant magazine. But it was not as successful as some people had hoped, and so it only existed for about 6 or 7 years. In the period 1950-1965, we find that we're also reacting constantly we are reacting to events that happened in the world, of Catholicism. We were strongly involved with an organization called Protestants and Other Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which was in fact quite anti-Catholic. And we were heavily involved with that. We find that Adventists were warned not to vote for Alfred Smith, who was a Catholic Democratic candidate for the presidency in 1924. But it must be admitted that many other Protestant churches warned against Alfred Smith becoming the president. Now, whether that actually made him lose the vote for the presidency is hard to tell, because at the same time, of course, there were lots of Catholics that supported him. But anyway, it was still a major issue, and certainly among Seventh-day Adventists, the fact that he was Catholic. Adventists paid a lot of attention to the political situation around 1929, when the papacy concluded a concordat with Mussolini, and the Vatican State, as we now know it, was created. And that, for Seventh-day Adventists, was a clear sign that now the wound, the deadly wound of the beast, was being healed. All the time we see that there is commotion when there is an effort, there is an attempt to appoint an ambassador at the Vatican, an American ambassador as the Vatican. Strong feelings that should not happen, that would be giving too much honor to the Pope, and that this would be the beginning of various serious consequences. When the Pope got involved in peace initiatives around the First World War and the Second World War, that was not always seen as something positive, but rather as the Pope wanted to play a major political role. And this, of course, fitted in the idea that the Pope would become very much more powerful as the time of the end approached. When the Second Vatican Council was taken place, the Adventist Church actually sent a number of reporters to observe what was happening and to write about what was happening. The two most prominent observers were the British Emerson, who was a prominent editor of the British church papers at that time, and of course Dr. Bert Beverly Beach, who for many decades was an important person in Adventist relationships with other churches and other organizations. Beach was there at all the time when the meetings were taking place, and spent a lot of time in Rome, wrote 2 books about his observations. And both Emerson and Beach were pleasantly surprised at at some of the things, at least, that were happening during the council, in particular when it concerned the religious liberty issue. At first, there was not much hope that the Catholic Church would change its attitude and maintain the idea that they were the only true church, and therefore had some reason to deny rights to other churches. But it was a happy surprise that the church, in fact, accepted religious liberty for all different religions, for all different worshippers. Did the Vatican Council bring any changes? The opinions were divided. Some said no, they were only cosmetic. Others said yes, it was indeed a great change in Roman Catholicism. When we look at 1965 to the present, we see a continued concern about things happening in Catholicism. When Kennedy became the presidential candidate, that still his Catholicism still played a major role among Seventh-day Adventists. Much less so, I believe, in more recent times, when we had Biden being a Roman Catholic. That did not play much of a role anymore, at least not to the same extent as it did at the time for Kennedy. What did make many Adventists worried were the papal visits to the United States. Why would the Pope come and be treated the way he was treated, as if he was an important also political person? There was a lot of protest against those papal visits, and even in recent times with billboards, etc., against this. Again, also about ambassadors to Rome. A number of times the American president had to give up on their proposal, on their plan to appoint an ambassador, but that finally happened, and that did not sit well with many Protestants, and certainly not sit well with many Seventh-day Adventists. There were education-related issues when it was felt that Catholicism claimed certain advantages that they had no right to. But in particular, also what has been in the Adventist mind was the fact that some Adventists got very friendly with the Pope, and some Adventists even visited the Pope, and some Adventists even allegedly kissed the ring of the Pope, although that has never been established that that was the case. But anyway, Adventists visiting the Pope, particular Bert Beach, and the current person in the Parle department at a GC, Diop, that is something that many Adventists find unbearable. Adventists commented on different encyclicals and apostolic letters, and sometimes there was some credit for some of the good things that were found in these documents, but of course the church always found some things to be worried about and to be critical about. I see that my time is running quickly, but okay. While we were criticizing Roman Catholicism, there was also an increasing emphasis on the need to actually evangelize Roman Catholics. And so we find that there is a shift in emphasis in order to make that possible, to approach individual Roman Catholics by saying, well, we're not so much object to you as an individual, as a Roman Catholic believer, but our main focus, anti-Catholic focus, is the institutional church, the papacy, the hierarchy. And then many point to quotations from Ellen White when she says, many Catholics will be saved. There are many conscientious Christians in the Roman Catholic community. And that, of course, motivated many people to say, yes, let's also go and try to win Catholics to become Seventh-day Adventists. Special materials were created for reaching Catholics, and even some novel-like books, like this book, A Brand from the Burning, which you still find in Adventist bookshops. And attempts have been made to make at least official Adventist literature less offensive, although I feel we still have quite a ways to go there. Recent trends, denominations become less and less important, it seems, and some people say that we are entering a time of post-denominationalism. That means, in the minds of many, that we should place a greater emphasis on trying to work together to at least come to mutual understanding, and also with regard to Roman Catholicism. And Protestants in general have shed most of their anti-Catholicism, and certainly also in the recent times when they see the new approach of Pope Francis and some other Catholic leaders. But in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we don't see that trend yet, and we see a great polarization around the idea of ecumenism. Some who feel that time has come for us to recognize other Christians besides ourselves, but others feel that that is just giving up the truth with capital T, and we must be as clear as we were in the past in our anti-Catholic attitude. And the massive great controversy distribution plans are a signal of that particular kind of attitude. I believe that we should look at the great controversy in a different light as we have done in the past, and also acknowledge new realities about Ellen G. White, the way that research has shown us that maybe the process of revelation, the process of inspiration, did not quite go as many have assumed, and that that has a bearing on how we look at her books and the status that her book, The Great Controversy, should have in the 21st century. Well, I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, but just a word about changes in prophetic interpretation. Are we still saying the same things, or are we gradually changing at least some of the emphases? And quickly, over time, some aspects have changed when we think about the theories of the daily sacrifice, the theory of the seven trumpets and Armageddon. Some of these things have changed. But the bigger question is, can we find not only these smaller changes, but can there be adaptations in the fundamental beliefs? Can they be expected? Will there be shifts in our theology, among our academics. There have been some shifts. The Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary that was created in the 1950s was a step forward, left some issues unsolved. The question is, will the historicist emphasis remain dominant? It seems that many of our theologians are a bit more careful than they were in the past and say, yes, historicism is important, but maybe there are other aspects, other approaches we should look at as well. And in any case, the academic books that are being published are more careful with regard to claims about Catholicism and Sunday laws. And there is more emphasis through what I would call the mainline authors in the church on the work of Jesus Christ. But on the fringes of the church, and certainly in the independent ministries, there is a very continued strong emphasis on anti-Catholicism, and I fear that is also the case with some of our leaders in the General Conference. Yet, we should remember that the General Conference put out a statement in 1997 where it said, "We reject bigotry against any person, regardless of race, nationality, or religious creed. Further, we gladly acknowledge that sincere Christians may be found in other denominations, including Roman Catholicism." So this is an official statement. Adventists seek to be fair in dealing with others. Thus, while we remain aware of the historical record and continue to hold our views regarding end-time events, we recognize some positive changes in recent Catholicism and stress the conviction that many Roman Catholics are brothers and sisters in Christ. I found this very hopeful in 1997. In fact, when Falkenberg wanted to have this statement, he also asked me for my input. And I find that some of the sentences that I proposed were actually found in this statement. I wish it had gone further, and I wished we had developed it even further in Roman Catholic times. Well, what we need, I think, is in our approach to the Catholic Church, more fairness, more balance. If we write about them, I think we need to use contemporary sources rather than using the many sources from the 19th century, as we often continue to do. We must give credit where credit is due. When there are positive changes, let us acknowledge those and avoid enemy thinking. It's high time, I think, to rethink some of the aspects of our end-time scenario and remember that other Christians are not our enemies, but in this world of secularism, materialism, in this world where Christianity, where churches are emptying, other Christians are not our enemies, but our allies. Well, I think we should give credit where credit is due and cooperate where possible, while acknowledging that there are many serious differences where we cannot make compromises, but with all the differences, there are also many things that we have in common with other Christians, even with Roman Catholics. Well, that was the content of this book, Adventists and Catholics. It is based on my dissertation in the 1990s. In my dissertation, I took the subject to 1965, the Second Vatican Council, and there were quite a few people who said, why don't you look at it again and bring it up to date? And that is what I've done. And I'm happy that this is now available as a resource for people who want to look at it in more detail. I'm somewhat embarrassed about the price that the publisher has put on the book. But then, should you want to order it, then what you see on the screen, it's orders@peterlang.com. And if you put the code Advent, then you will receive a 30% discount. Otherwise, go to Amazon. That is the quickest way of getting the book if you want it. Well, that is, let me see. Yes. Are we back?
Yep. We're back.
Good.
Thank you. Reinder, I was delighted to catch your presentation in La Sierra. And I thank you so much for bringing your dissertation and its thoughts to a wider community. I was particularly pleased at the responses to your presentation there. Those were interesting. Today, everyone here will have an opportunity to respond as well, perhaps not in as carefully chosen words as those did. They seemed rather constrained and meticulous to me. I wish we could have some more impromptu conversations, and maybe we can do that. George, you've been on. Let us know where your head is with this. And Reinder, pay attention to what George has to say here.
I always do.
Yeah, he takes chances, you know. Reinder, thank you for another presentation. I watched your presentation in La Sierra. I watched your interview with Peter Dixon. I'm watching this presentation, and I read a great part of your book already. Thank you for that help you gave me there. I am following you. Another reason for following you besides learning is to catch you saying something that will justify you will be banned from La Sierra University for making a presentation there, which was very unfortunate and crazy. So far, I cannot find anything about your work that could justify any intervention from Ted Wilson to stop you. And it seems that in a week from today, on Saturday, David Larson will have also Dr. Hans Gutierrez in Loma Linda, and it was supposed to be at the university, I guess, but it will be at a private home. So something happened there again too, because Dr. Hans Gutierrez is another good scholar that is very, very talented and speaks his mind. My question for you will be only one. At this point, after so many days and presentations, what is your opinion, your personal opinion? What is Ted Wilson afraid of? Your presentation is clean, is good, there's nothing there against the church, nothing. But he's afraid of something that is making him behave unhinged, crazy, I would say. Do you have any clue, any idea? How do you feel? What's your feeling about what is the real reason for all this fiasco from the GC?
Well, that is a difficult question to answer. This book did not just come out of heaven or fall out of the sky, but it has basically, most of it has basically been available since 1993, when Andrews University Press published my dissertation. And interestingly, they sold of that dissertation about 3,000 copies over time, which is quite exceptional, I think, for a dissertation to sell that many copies. That did not bring very much commotion at that time. Yes, there were some who were worried, but by and large, there were positive criticisms. There was a bit of commotion when I condensed a few years later the content into an article for Spectrum. And then I received a letter from the Biblical Research Institute and told me how much they regretted that I had done that. They said this was highly irresponsible. At that time, I was the General Secretary of the Trans-European Division. And they said it was highly irresponsible for a church leader to publish something like that, that would maybe cause doubt in the minds of people, etc., etc. Now, I took issue with Angel Rodriguez, who wrote that letter, who was in charge of the Biblical Research Institute at that time. And I said, look, it does not basically differ from my dissertation, and you never objected to my dissertation. Whereupon he said, well, you know, we all know that when you write a dissertation, you have to please your professor in order to get your degree. But this is a different kind of thing. Now you go to a larger audience, church audience, and you acted, again, he said, very irresponsible. But that was, you know, something that, well, he sent that letter to many people around, you know, my division president, the general conference president, et cetera, but there were no further repercussions. And so that died down. But now, all of a sudden, it seems that after Loma Linda, it was going to be in Loma Linda, the speech, after Loma Linda had announced it, and maybe they did that a little bit too provocative in the minds of many, but anyway, it was announced on the campus quite widely. And Fulcrum 7 got hold of it. And I don't think that is the most inspirational Christian source in the world, but it seems that Elder Wilson is a follower of Fulcrum. And in fact, Fulcrum voices many of the concerns of the ultra-conservative fringe in the church. And Wilson that is my analysis. He has not talked to me about it, even though he could have taken the phone and called me, because we know each other. And although he has risen to greater heights than I have, but we worked together 4 years in the same office in West Africa, and were in contact on an almost daily basis. So if he would really have been worried about me and where I was going, then maybe he could have given me a call or something. But that's my analysis. He has been greatly impressed by these comments that came from the ultra-right, and that made him decide that Loma Linda should cancel. And he put a lot of pressure on the president of Loma Linda University to cancel it. There were originally some plans to then bring it to La Sierra University, and the same kind of pressure was applied. And so a few prominent people at Loma Linda and La Sierra, they decided that they would save the event and find an off-campus locale, place of venue for the lecture. It was good that it was possible from there to stream the event. And so one might say that the president of the General Conference has done me a great favor of making sure that this would become a much bigger event than it would otherwise have been. And some 10,000 people worldwide have watched the lecture. But those who have watched it, I don't think the majority will not find that it was very revolutionary. And it was not my intention at all to be revolutionary, nor with the book, not with the book, nor with the lecture. And yes, I find it strange that it causes so much commotion and trouble. Now, it is not, I think, by accident that a week after the lecture, Clifford Goldstein published a column in the Adventist Review about this topic of our attitude towards Rome. And I just heard and just watched part of it that Walter Veit last week had an hour-long program devoted to this topic. So I'm not sure. I had expected some negative comments here and there, but that it would still excite people to this extent is a bit beyond me. Well, I don't know, George, whether I have answered, but what makes Wilson so? Let me say this, that I still believe that Elder Wilson is honest and that he wants to protect the church against people who, in his view, are putting some of our doctrines, traditions in doubt. And that is what he wants to avoid. But he has, it seems, counselors who are not very wise. And the way he does this so-called protection, I think does the adverse. Okay.
Thank you, Reinder. George, you're muted again. If you have something more to say, unmute. You okay? Okay. Mark Carr, I value your perspective. I suspect it's somewhat unique. What's your observation on this?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Reinder. I'm literally in the midst of drafting a book review for Spectrum of your book. I've enjoyed every moment of it. It's not the first of your books that I've reviewed. So first of all, thank you for doing what you do through the years. I find the parallels within Catholicism and Adventism striking, one of which is the popish behavior of our own Elder Wilson. As you described, the BRI's response to your column, it reminded me immediately of what in Catholicism they refer to as theological scandal, which I would say within Adventism, we mirror that regularly. And then a step deeper into notions of scandal is what Catholics refer to as Pharisaical scandal. And I would urge everyone to Google those terms and learn a bit more about how a church manages itself, because they simply have 1,500 years or so head start on us. We're not different. They're not different. They just have had a long time doing these things. I want to push just a bit, Reinder, because I would love that your book had more. You are retired now. I think you're more free to speak freely. If that impression of having been an employee and no longer an employee is accurate, I think retired persons can speak more freely. I'd like to know more about your notions of biblical hermeneutics in particular. And one illustration I think that is worthwhile, already been brought up, is Hans Gutierrez's perspective. So there's a lot of European perspective in early Adventism and in your own review of early Adventism. What do we make of the voices from around the world now? And Hans, having been educated in South America, in Europe, Central America, Italy, he has a pretty profound perspective, but his credentials were recently yanked from him. I don't know how many of the audience knows this. His credentials were yanked from him by an international ministerial association that Elder Wilson leads, without even the decency of talking to him about the fact that his credentials would be taken away. What do we make of a scholar like Hans Gutierrez and his perspective on our history? Thanks again, Reinder. Appreciate it.
Well, I was wondering who would review my book for Spectrum, and so I know, you're always wondering whether it will be a review from a, let us say, more or less friendly perspective. But yeah. Just commenting on Hans Gutierrez, I know him quite well. A very pleasant and also a very erudite person. I know few persons in our community who are that erudite, and that, of course, makes his writing sometimes a little dense. But yes, he has lost his teaching credentials. He has not lost his ministerial credentials. And I believe that has been mostly the work of some people in the inter-European division. But he is still teaching there. And as far as I know, there is no danger that he will be fired. The university, small university in Italy, is led actually by somebody who is not a theologian, but who is a legal scholar. And in cases like this, that might be an important point. And they say, well, we have hired him and we pay his salary and nothing changes as far as we are concerned. But it is a sign not of strength, but of weakness when a person who may have a viewpoint that is somewhat different, but when that person who has been teaching for an Adventist school for so many years, who has written widely, who is respected widely, when that person cannot get a opportunity to speak at an Adventist institution, that is a sad day. Now, when I was going to have my talk at Loma Linda, one of the people who was going to respond was Dr. Denis Fortin. Now, he when he heard that we were no longer welcome at Loma Linda, he canceled his flight, and then he could not come to be as a respondent when I actually gave the talk. But he was invited to Loma Linda in next March to give the Baldwin lecture. And somehow he has been disinvited from giving that lecture. So it seems that he has also become persona non grata. And if this is something that will continue, and when they have no difficulty inviting people like Doug Batchelor and other people, but have a great problem in inviting people like Gutierrez and Fortin, then that is something that is quite serious, I think. why did not, that is the question, Mark, why did I not go more into hermeneutics? And maybe in particular in the way in which we deal with apocalyptic prophecy. Well, the book was meant to be a historical account of how we have dealt with our feelings towards the Roman Catholic Church. And I wanted it to be a mostly historical account. I have certain feelings with regard to the way we should deal with the prophecies, and that might have made the book more controversial than I wanted it to be. Now, I must admit also that there are people who know much more about hermeneutics and could write such a book much more ably than I could. But so far, I'm surprised that in the responses that I get on the negative side, there is seldom any attempt to provide some arguments as to why people say what they say. It is, some people say it is rubbish what I write, but they at the same time admit that they never read a line of what I have written because they know it is heretical, and they know that my purpose is just to break down the church. So, and that is maybe the saddest part of all, that much of the, well, opposition, much of the hostility also is without any arguments, but mostly it seems fear that some of the things that we have always said maybe not as certain as they had imagined, and that causes fear, and that causes apparently hostility.
Thank you so much for broaching the topic and making it one of common Adventist conversation. I think its time has come, Reinder. Thank you. Carmen, you've got a perspective. Share, would you please?
I do have a perspective like everyone else. Oh, that was funny. Thank you. I'm going to try and say Reinder.
Yes.
Did I get it right?
Yes, you got it right.
Okay, nice to see you, and thank you so much for the presentation. And this last comment you made gives me lots of things to think about. We recently watched a documentary about religious liberty in the United States. And one of the things that was striking about it was most of us have thought of the United States as the refuge for the people who were religiously oppressed to come and have absolute religious freedom, when there wasn't that much religious freedom. It was probably a little better than in the old world, but it depended which colony you were at. But one of the most important things there, as far as Adventists, that made me think about that anti-Catholicism is how severe the anti-Catholicism was. Things like the Bible riots, which interestingly took place in 1844 against Catholics, and also the Mormons. And during revolutionary times before that, before the 19th century, the Baptists had been severely persecuted in America. All of them much more seriously than anything that happened to the Sabbath keepers. And so it was interesting to think about Ellen White seeing what happened to other groups once there was opposition to them, and thinking perhaps, well, this gives us a view of what will happen to us. On the other hand, it was rather sad to think, because I've read a lot of her, and I don't see her actually denouncing a lot of that, except in the interest of our own religious liberty.
Mhm.
I don't see a lot of defense of the Catholics or the Mormons, and that was going on in her lifetime.
Yeah, and I think you're right there. Just on the one hand, she does not seem to focus much on the world outside of the West, Europe, and the United States, and forgets about the rest of the world, like Islam and etc. etc. And at the same time, yes, in America, she seems to be very focused just on some aspects, and in particular as they affect the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And there is still the temptation in our religious freedom, our work for religious freedom, to focus on ourselves. And do we have the right to keep the Sabbath? And do we have the right to keep certain people out of employment, et cetera, rather than to look at some of the other things that are happening in the world and that need to concern us? Yeah.
Yes, other groups that we could stand beside.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, amicus standing is always commendable, I believe. I
Mhm.
appreciate that, Carmen. Thank you. Emmanuel, you've been on for a bit. Please unmute. Share with us. Emmanuel, go ahead. You vanished from my screen somehow.
Emmanuel is there, but his voice isn't coming through. So maybe he needs to work on his microphone a little bit.
Well, why don't you proceed then, Lauren? You had your hand up next. I appreciate that.
Oh, well, thank you. This was excellent. By the way, I was very gratified that you mentioned Bert Beach, Reinder, somebody I really admire. I got to meet him before he died, talked with him a little bit. He had come to my church to preach some years ago, maybe 15, no, might 20 years ago now. He was a good friend of the head elder of my church. And he stood up and just let loose. I was so proud of him. The thing I remember him saying was he was describing something going on, and he stopped for a moment and he said, "Have you ever noticed that the people who seem to know everything that's going to happen in the future are trying to avoid dealing with what's happening right now?" And
Mhm.
I thought, Burke, you hit it. I told him years later that I remembered that, and he says, "I don't remember saying it, but it sounds like something I would say." And I remembered it very vividly. It was beautifully done. I will say this, Reinder, your book is called "The History of a Turbulent Relationship," and yet it isn't much of a relationship, really. I don't know that Roman Catholics have engaged very much with Seventh-day Adventists, if at all.
Mhm.
We're a little bit like the person who stands off and says that person is my enemy, but never tells them they're their enemy. And I'm not sure it would make a whole lot of difference to the Roman Catholics if we did. I've had several lovely Roman Catholic friends through the years, clerics actually, I mean, religious, one way or the other, priests, others, and in every case, nobody has ever said, "Hey, aren't you Adventists the ones that think that we're absolutely horrible and are going to bring on the Sunday law?" None of them knew a thing about it. I wonder if they have any idea. And yet, I have Seventh Adventist friends who say, "Oh yeah, I truly believe that the Pope and his cardinals are sitting around saying, 'What are we going to do about those Seventh-day Adventists? We've got to gear up to really persecute them.'" I see no evidence that they have any interest whatsoever in us. So
Mhm.
I would say it's a rather one-sided relationship, if you can call it a relationship at all.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you're right, and maybe I should have thought of that a little bit more carefully. But that's an afterthought. And I think you're right that we are not a problem for the Catholic Church,
No.
and we are hardly on their radar in most countries. Now, there may be a few countries where we are on their radar. There are a few countries in the world, small countries, where there are about as many Catholics as there are Adventists, and maybe the situation is different there. But then it would be interesting also to note whether they have found a way of living together more peacefully than we do in other places. Now, I appreciate your positive referral to Bert Beach, who is unfortunately no longer with us. I think I might call myself I might say that I was a good friend of Beach. He was a good friend of mine. And we go back a long time. When I was working in the Trans-European Division, my portfolio was also religious freedom and the Parle department. And we were dealing with situations in the Baltic countries and in Hungary and other places in trying to get back some of the properties that were taken from the church in the communist era. And then we traveled very extensively together in those years. And also later, when they would visit Europe, they would always make a point in stopping. And Bert Beach was always a good source also of the latest news, because there was very little that he did not know about the inner workings of the church and of the GC. He was great for a good dose of gossip, and which I always very much appreciated, but a very loyal kind of friend. And maybe I could relate an anecdote or something that shows what kind of person he was. One day when we were, I think it was in Latvia, and it was Friday afternoon, and I was ready to go to my hotel and do something else. And he asked the union president, and he says, "Now, this so-and-so person who was the union president here, is he still alive?" "Yes, he's still alive. So let's go and visit him." Well, the union president didn't like it very much, that idea. He also wanted to go home. No, he says, "Let's go and see him." So we went to see he was an elderly man at that time. And so 2 weeks later, we were together in Hungary. And on Friday afternoon, Beach said, "Is so-and-so still alive?" And he said, "Let's go see him." And this happened a number of times when I was traveling with him. And so I said, "Why do you do this?" And then he said, "Well, look, my father was the secretary of the General Conference. The moment he was no longer the secretary, nobody ever visited him." He says, "I have made it a point of my missionary work that when I go to places, I will go and see some of these old geezers." And,
he was a pastoral man.
That really made me think differently about him, because he could be a bit arrogant, a bit.
Yeah.
But a good man. Good man.
I thought the world of him, and still do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a lovely anecdote. Thank you. Cherry Ann Farquharson, tell us where your thoughts have been taken by Reinder today.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning. So I have been kind of following a little tangentially, what has been happening with the presentations and with the books and everything. And you said, I forgot the word you used to describe Ted Wilson's advisors, but the word that I would use is that I find them and a lot of persons in the church, particularly those I grew up around, to be close-minded. Some context. You spoke about some of the countries where Adventists may be on the radar of the Roman Catholics. I grew up in one of those countries in Jamaica, where the largest single denomination is Seventh-day Adventist. But I think that's about as far as it goes in terms of us being on their radar. They're aware that there are a lot of us, and they will encounter us all the time. But in terms of the apocalyptic views and all of those things, when I've spoken to persons I've interacted with, my friends who are Catholic, I am the one who are telling them all of these things. They have never heard about it. But one of the challenges I've found, and why I describe advisors and persons like that as closed-minded, is the way that I grew up. Whenever I was handed a piece of Christian literature, the first thing I did was to flip to the back to see if it had been published by Inter-American Division Publishing or West Indies Union Press, or just confirming that it was Adventist literature. And if it wasn't, then very likely I wouldn't have read it. And I'm now in a space where I have persons who were mentors, who are great friends, who are like family, who were leaders in the church when I was growing up, who they're the ones who introduced me to Walter Reith. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you people believe this. But I have great love and respect for these persons, but they still continue in that vein of being very discriminatory with what they read and what they're exposed to the point where I find that they're not able to discern or to appreciate other views because they don't interact with any other worldviews. The final thing I'll share, and I know I haven't quite given you a question just yet, but I remember when with the Paris Agreement for climate change, that is the space that I work with as an energy professional. And I remember when the Pope was in support of that. And so what I then heard from these same leaders of the church who were my mentors growing up was that this whole climate rhetoric is going to be used by the Pope to usher in the Sunday laws and to be a means of control for the world. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but all the science says this is something that we all need to be concerned about. So I guess with all of that, I don't know if there's anything to be said, to share with persons like that who are so limited in their worldview that they can't appreciate the benefit of any other denominations, any other religions, other than the "Thus saith the Lord" through the lens of Adventist interpretation. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. And yes, many have a tendency to only want to read what comes from our own sources. And they miss out on a lot of good things, even things that come from the Catholic side. And I think that those of us who know a bit about theology are appreciative of some of the very fine books that have been written by Catholic theologians. And even the previous Pope, he wrote a couple of very beautiful books about Jesus Christ and about death and the life to come. We may not agree on everything that he has written, but that is true for many of the books that we read, even many of the Adventist books that we may read. But we should be thankful for the great contributions that have also come from others. And to me, yes, it is surprising to see that argument being made that climate change and everything that goes with it, that if we support that, we are really in cahoots with the Catholic Church. But there is such a deep suspicion for everything that the Catholic Church does. And may I give an example of this? When we had a meeting of all parole directors. Now, parole, that is the public affairs and religious liberty of the church, and there are representatives at the conference level, at the union level, the division level, and all of those who were delegates to the General Conference in Toronto, they came to a meeting prior to the General Conference, and we had a meeting there of about 200, 250 people. It was led out by Bert Beach, and I also had a role in the proceedings. And this was relatively shortly after the encyclical letter of Dies Domini. Now, Adventists got very worked up about the fact that in the letter, in the apostolic letter, the Pope had mentioned, and I'm quoting from memory, that the state should make sure that people could have their day of rest on Sunday. And so there was a lot of protest from the Adventists. What is this? And this surely is a sign of Sunday promotion and a sign that eventually there will be Sunday laws and that the Pope is already making preparations. And so when the encyclical, the letter appeared, Bert Beach wrote a letter to the Vatican, and he asked what the meaning was of this and whether they felt that the same kind of protection by the state should be given to people who have a different day of rest. And then a few months later, there finally came an answer, and it was coming from the Department of the Protection of the Faith, and it said that it was apologetic and said that that should have been mentioned in the letter, but of the Pope, but that was an oversight, and of course the same protection should be afforded to people who have a different day of rest than the Catholic Church. Now, during that meeting, we distributed copies of the letter that was sent to the Vatican and copies of the letter that was received in return. More than half of the people who were present thought that the letter from the Vatican was actually a fabrication by Dr. Beach, because it was impossible that the Catholic Church should have said something like that. And this was such a tragic illustration of the fact that, facts sometimes don't matter. This is the idea that we have. The Catholic Church is just not able of doing anything positive and cannot be that generous as was expressed in that letter. Yeah, we have a long way to go.
We do need a bogeyman, do we not? That's sad. Marcello Rice, where are we joining you today?
Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm speaking from Belgium.
Wonderful.
Yes. Reinder, thank you very much for your presentation. We actually had the privilege to be with you here in Bruges in February this year. Was a blessing.
Yes.
I have a question. So your presentation was about change in the history of the Adventist Church and the Catholic Church. I watched also the first presentation you did in Loma Linda was very nice, interesting. My question is precisely with regard to this view about change in our church. So I am an Adventist for 15 years, so I'm young compared to some people here in the faith. But I have changed a lot over the years. I was baptized in 2009, and at the time I was baptized, I held some beliefs about the Catholic Church, about Protestant churches. But of course, I traveled to many countries. I lived in many countries. I met people with different views. And I read books, I studied theology, I did a master's in theology. And at some point for me, I couldn't just hold to the same beliefs I held when I was baptized. So I changed it and I moved. But some time ago, so the president of our church, Elder Wilson, he, I think it was in the in the spring meetings in April, he said that some of the leaders of our church who do not believe anymore in some doctrines, they should leave the church. They should, I'm not sure whether he said they should leave the church or they should leave their posts in the church as a church leader or as a pastor. But what I'm not sure about you, whether when you became an Adventist or as you grew up, what were your views on the Catholic Church and how you changed your views? What made you to change your views about the Catholic Church? And what would you say about people who think we have to hold on to the same beliefs we held when we got baptized? So we cannot evolve, we cannot change our views. Because when we get baptized, we make a profession of faith, we have baptismal vows. And I do hold still on to many of the beliefs I had when I was baptized, but I matured and I changed a lot over the years. And the view of some church leaders, as I said, is that if we do not agree with some of the beliefs that we as Adventists officially have, we should leave the church. And to be honest, I hear that quite often from some people. And they say, even if you're a church leader, it is unethical for you to not hold to some beliefs anymore. So if you do not hold to some beliefs anymore, you should leave either your job in the church or you should leave the church. But I struggle with that because I do value Adventism. There is a lot in Adventism I love. So should we just lie to ourselves and pretend we cannot change? So I would like to hear what is your views on that. And if you perhaps could share with us what made you change your views on the Catholic Church. If you did, that perhaps would be interesting to hear as well. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Reinder,
Marcelo.
I anticipate your help, Reinder, because Marcello is asking a question that is common to almost all of us on this forum. Extremely relevant. Thank you, Marcello.
I think so. And I was very happy to come to your church and preach in your church, Marcelo, and let's do it again sometime in the future. And besides, he lives in a very beautiful, or the church is in a very beautiful place in Bruges, you know. Well, and greetings to your wife also.
Thank you.
Well, yes, Wilson and some others have said repeatedly that if you cannot agree to all the 28 fundamental beliefs, then it is a matter of decency to leave the church. Now, first of all, I was baptized when we only had 22 fundamental beliefs. So how is that? Is there a different standard for me than for you when you have been baptized when there were 27? You may have heard also about the campaign that was conducted in New Guinea last year. Was it last year or early this year? But very recently. A couple of 100,000 people were baptized after a relatively short period. nobody can convince me that these people all are aware of all the 28 fundamental beliefs. So why can they become members of the church if they have a limited knowledge of the 28 fundamental beliefs? And why must we, when we convince people in our culture, tell them you have to say yes to all the aspects of all the 28 fundamental beliefs? Now, this has never been the historic position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I'm sure that there will be a correction sometime soon, because this is simply not what should be the standard. True enough, if you want to work for the church or want to continue to associate with the church, there must be enough affinity with what Adventism is and what it does in order to be really part of the community. But to say that you cannot have any idea about a number of doctrines that are somewhat different from the tradition, and that will not make you a true Adventist. It's not up to Wilson to decide that. In the end, it is my local church that decides whether I can be a member in good and regular standing. And I would hope that in the country where I work, there is sufficient sense of that a certain amount of plurality must be acceptable in order to have a healthy church. And I think, Marcelo, that is still the case also in the conference in Belgium where you work. And let's hope it remains that way. My feelings announcing with respect to Roman Catholicism, I grew up in a village where about 1/3, maybe a little more, of the people were Roman Catholics. They lived in one area of the, mostly at least, in one part of the village. Now, the Protestants and the Catholics, they were in fact in many ways separate sub-communities. And we had two supermarkets. Well, they were not quite supermarkets, but one was run by a Catholic and one was run by a Protestant. And of course, we would not go to a Catholic supermarket, and we would not go to the Catholic baker, and so on. So there was a very much a distinction between Catholics and Protestants, even in the context in which I grew up. But as I met more and more Catholics, as I studied, I became aware of the fact that it's not quite as clear-cut that there is one church that has all the truth and there are no other churches that have any truth. I came to the conclusion that it is much more complicated than that. And as time went on, I also felt that maybe we should look in a different way at the inspiration of Ellen White. And although I still recognize her as an important person in our church, and there is certain still value in the work that she did and the initiatives that she supported, but she does not have the last word about pickles, and she does not have the last word about the last day events and exactly the timetable that we were supposed to follow. So I no longer accept that the statements that she made also about Roman Catholicism are valid for this time and age. We don't know what will happen. Of course, there may be developments within Catholicism that would tend to go in the direction that she has indicated. But what I see around me in my own country and what you see in Belgium is that the Catholic Church is actually struggling to survive. and they have many of the same problems that we have, and some are worse. In fact, one of the Catholic cardinals said that we must be sure that the Catholic Church in Belgium does not become a sect rather than a proper church. So there are a number of different reasons why a person develops. You indicated that you have developed in your thinking, and I would hope that process would continue, because that is what makes us a healthy individual, and that is also what the church needs.
Thank you, Reinder. And Marcello, hang in there. Be a progressive Adventist or just be a progressive Christian and take it where you must go. Keep the faith, brother. Thank you. Robert Johnston, you are a host of Sage Advice. What do you have for us now? You're still muted. Let's try that again. You're still muted, Robert.
Okay.
There you go.
Sorry.
You're on. Go ahead.
Before I make my observations, could you kindly repeat the book ordering information? It was taken down too fast, and some of us
Actually,
couldn't get it down.
Bob, I did put it up in the comments.
In the chat?
I will.
I couldn't
repeat
find
again.
it. Well, anyway.
Yeah, I'll put it
What was
up
the
again.
code number? Maybe that'd be the important thing.
Yeah, I'll put it up again.
The code number is Advent. ADVENT.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Okay, well, the observation that I wanted to make is that our administrators don't have a problem in making common cause with Catholics and Catholic organizations when it is useful.
Mhm.
Give a couple of examples. A few decades ago, we had the Mary Kay issue about hiring and salaries for denominational works. And this was in the time of Neil Wilson, Ted's father. And we hired a Roman Catholic attorney to handle it. And the arguments that he made were based on Catholic precedent. Another incident, I think it was in the Midwest, the Middle America Union in the United States. Our hospitals were kind of struggling, and we wanted to join with the Roman Catholic Hospital Association, and did, in fact. Now, there was a lot of kickback and a lot of objection to it by particularly conservative Adventists. And I don't know whether that union survived or not, but it did for a while. And those are just a couple of examples. They're not totally unique. Also, we, at least two of our professors at Andrews University got their degrees from Notre Dame. And a very conservative Adventist, Ed Zinke, I think, pursued a degree at Catholic University of America. So there are certain contexts in which our administrators and others don't have a problem with making common cause with Catholics.
Yes, and Neil Wilson actually, at that time that you referred to, compared his position to that of the Pope.
Yes, that's right.
In the hierarchy, that there is just somebody at the top of the hierarchy that coordinates things. Yeah, that was a very significant kind of. I found that we were willing to work with Catholics, but then sometimes we would get cold feet. And I think I told the incident. I talked about the incident when we saw each other lately, Lauren, and a few of you may have heard it. But when I worked,
I was hoping you'd tell that story.
Okay. When I worked for a number of years in West Africa, I was in Cameroon in the publishing house, printing house that we have there, and I became good friends with the colleague in the Catholic publishing house in Cameroon. Now, it so happened that at that time the Pope visited Cameroon, and my Catholic colleague, he had to print a brochure with the program of the papal visit to Cameroon. And it so happened that while he was doing that, his press broke down. And so he came to me and he said, I know this may be difficult for you, but could you please print this brochure for me? Because, you know, otherwise we are in trouble and the Pope is coming next week. And so I said, well, just bring it and I'll finish it for you and no problem. Now, word of that got to the division office in Abidjan in Ivory Coast. And Ted Wilson was there at that time as a departmental director. And he heard about that and he found that this was extremely poor judgment on my part. I should never have done that. And, you know, I came close, I think, if it had been up to him, to be fired. And later, many years later, when I was working in the administration of the Trans-European Division, we were at an annual council in Costa Rica. And at the end of the council, my wife and I and Ted and his wife Nancy, we were sitting at the same table at the final dinner. And then he leaned over to me and he said, you know, Reinder, now you remember there in Cameroon that you printed that brochure for the Pope? I said, yeah, I sure remember that. He said, now in retrospect, what do you think of that? You see, this was more than 15 years later, and it was still on his mind as a problem. So I said, well, Ted, I have often thought about that, but I really think I made a mistake because I should not have sent them an invoice for it. And so that kind of left him speechless. But then, and that is where we come back to your point, Bob. In Cameroon, we would rent a meeting place in one of the Catholic institutions because they would almost give it to us free. And so we would be very happy to use such a meeting place for all kinds of events that took place. And so there is this double kind of thinking. When we can benefit, we work together. If it is just to do them a favor, well, that becomes a different kind of thing. So, yeah.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Robert, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Good. Wonderful anecdote. Thank you so much. Eduardo, you've been very patient.
Okay.
You're on.
Thank you. Reinder, allow me to read something from the congressional record of February 4, 1915. A subtitle says, "The Anti-Papal Panic." And it says, "It's evident that we are in another fierce anti-Catholic crusade. Religious contention is worse than epidemic of smallpox, yellow fever, and I say COVID-19. This is mainly insanity. And there is no worse enemy of Christ or of this country than the men who seek to inflame and poison the mind of other Protestants or Catholics. with suspicions and fears and resentment and enmities toward each other. This conflagration of hate is already well started. This is the congressional record of the February 4, 1915. And you can see and you read mostly the congressional record, about 60 or more pages, is about immigration. But you can find this there. And it's because Dr. Washington Gladden wrote or gave 6 sermons and three titles. Why we preach against the Catholic Church. Sermon 1, Sermon 5, Rome's bloody hands. Sermon 6, Romanism and the American institutions. You also
I no longer hear you.
I think we lost him.
I think your bandwidth vanished, Eduardo.
He got locked up.
Eduardo, if you come back, we'll come back to that. Reinder, did you have any response to what he was saying thus far?
No, I was trying to work out what the point was that I should respond to. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't quite clear to me either. Linda Nottingham, I love you. Thank you so much for being here. Please unmute and let's hear what this fertile mind has.
Oh, always good to see you too, Jerry.
Oh, absolutely.
Reinder, you mentioned, or it was just a brief allusion once or twice, and thank you again for the presentation. I had read the transcript of your presentation in La Sierra, but today was different and more, and so I'm grateful for it. I'm glad that I came. But in a couple of very subtle places, you mentioned that some, if not a number, of our Adventist scholars and theologians are doing some rethinking about how our denomination has historically interpreted particularly eschatological passages. And I'm curious about that. I'm wondering, not to make it so much of a binary choice, but is it because they have come up with alternate ideas about what those prophecies might mean? Or is it because there perhaps is no real clarity or understanding of some of those rather obscure prophecies? I remember once when I had to study for a class that I taught, I teach an adult class, that if memory serves me, there were like 150 historical revisions of the 7 trumpet prophecy, for example. There was a lot of redoing over time. And so is it that there are alternate theories that are floating around out there, but nobody's published yet? Or is it just that we need to have perhaps more of a tolerance for ambiguity or uncertainty? I mean, if in some phantasmagorical world, if our denomination said, we were wrong about all those interpretations, what would that do, and what would that look like? What kind of spot would we be in?
It's a difficult question to answer. I would say that in general, the more academic approaches to the prophecies, they tend to be much more careful than they were in the past. But there is there are certain boundaries that you cannot pass. When from Andrews University, the professor who wrote a book on Daniel, or was it Revelation? What's his name? Help me, Lauren.
Are you talking about Sam Bakioki?
No, somebody.
He has a French name.
Yeah. Well,
I know who you mean. I know who you're talking.
he wrote a quarterly on
Mhm. Yes.
apocalyptic prophecies, and that became quite a bit of a problem. It went back and forth, and even when most of it was already done, it had still to be revised by
Mhm.
intervention from on high.
Yeah, he said he didn't recognize it. I've
Yeah.
heard him say that he didn't
Yeah.
recognize it when it was printed.
But that's an illustration about how much scrutiny there is when somebody writes about these topics. And so when you very carefully say that maybe not only the historicist application is valid, but maybe we should also look a bit closer at what it meant in the first century, or maybe leave it a little bit more open as to what it will be in the future, then there is that far that you can say before you will find that your book will not be published. When John Pauline held a speech, what is it now, 2-3 years ago, at the invitation of the South California Conference, and he just carefully indicated that maybe the book, The Great Controversy, should be more read against its 19th century background, what I have been saying. And he said that maybe we will have to take a different look at this idea of a global Sunday law and the persecution. That really became a big deal. And when you see some of the comments that he received, and I wonder whether he would have survived had he not been retired at that point. So, and we know what happened when Ford came with his theory of Antiochus Epiphanes in the book of Daniel, and when he suggested that maybe there is this repetitive fulfillment of Bible prophecies and so on. Now, maybe his problem with the church was finally in the area of the sanctuary and the investigative judgment more than with the apocalyptic prophecies. But still, you wonder whether he could have survived because of his differences in prophetic interpretation. So Tonstad is probably the one who has developed more of a different approach and published that than anyone else. But then he is also no longer really employed full-time by an Adventist institution. So maybe the problem is that we have, if you want to have your book published in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there are very few places where you can go if it is somewhat different from mainline Seventh-day Adventist interpretation. It's fairly well controlled, everything. And that cannot be good for the health of the church long term. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should just quit with everything that we have said in the past, and many of the views that maybe should be refined, perhaps, but are still valid. But there should be more liberty. There should be more freedom to talk about these things, to write about these things, and to have a plurality of views more than on the positive side. There is a greater emphasis in many of the books on Revelation in particular lately on the role of Christ. That started with the book The Lamb Among the Beasts. That was an important new approach to not just speak about these beasts, but to see the centrality of Christ in the book of Revelation. Well, I'm not sure that I'm answering your question.
I think the one that wrote one of the quarterlies on Revelation, Lauren, you'll remember his name. His first name is spelled like Dennis, but he pronounces it Denis. Isn't
it is
Ranko
Stefanich you were talking about. Stefanovic.
Yes, Stefanovic is the one who said he didn't recognize his own
Yeah.
Puerto. But
Yep.
Denis has also said something like that about
Yeah.
just the
Okay.
stuff that they edited for him too.
Well, I guess as the ages and the careers of more of these theologians progress, perhaps there will be greater clarity for us. I don't know, but thank you very much.